Chapter 19 of Some Eminent Women of Our Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT. Chapter 19, Sister Dora. One of the most remarkable women who, in recent times, have devoted themselves to nursing and to the service of the sick poor was Dorothy Windlaw Pattison, more generally known by the name of Sister Dora. She was a lady born and bred, well-educated, high-spirited, sweet-tempered, and handsome, full of fun and sense of humor, fond of hunting and other athletic exercises, and remarkably fond of her own way. As her own way was generally a good way, she was probably right in preferring it to the ways of other people. Strong determination, when it does not degenerate into stupid obstinacy, is one of the most useful qualities any human being can have. In Sister Dora's case, her strong will was a great secret of her success, but it also in a few instances led her into errors, which will easily be seen as the story of her life is told. She was born in 1832 in Hawkswell in Yorkshire, a small village on the slope of a hill looking towards the moors and Wensleydale. Her father was the clergyman of the village, and one of her brothers was the Reverend Mark Pattison, the well-known scholar, and the rector of Lincoln College, Oxford. Dorothy Pattison was first roused to wish for something more than the ordinary occupations of a young lady's life by the enthusiasm felt throughout England in 1856 for Miss Florence Nightingale's work in the Crimea. Dorothy wished to join Miss Nightingale's band of lady nurses at the seat of war, but her parents' opposition and her own want of training prevented her from carrying out this wish. From this time, however, she fretted against the life of comparative inactivity to which she was restricted so long as she remained in her village home. Some years were passed, wasted, we may well think, in unnecessary friction between herself and her father, she desiring to leave home and he opposing her wishes in this respect. At last she did leave in 1861, more or less in the face of her father's opposition. He declined to make her any allowance beyond what he had been accustomed to give her for pocket money and clothes, and she had therefore to live partly on what she was able to earn. She obtained work as a village schoolmistress at Little Woolston, near Bletchley, and lived for 3 years in a small cottage, quite alone, without even a servant. Her life at this time must have been very much like that described in Jane Eyre, where the heroine gains her livelihood for a time by similar work. She showed as a village schoolmistress that keen sympathy with children and power over them which always distinguished her. She could enter through her bright imagination into the feelings and thoughts of children, and her playfulness and love of fun made her a real friend and companion to them. At Little Woolston, too, she did a good deal of amateur nursing for the parents and friends of her little pupils. Her biographer, Miss Lonsdale, says that the people in the neighbourhood of the village were very quick to discover that the new schoolmistress was a real lady, but for some time they could not get over their astonishment if they should find Miss Pattison blacking her own grate when they came to see her. She was, perhaps, the first instance they had come across of a cultivated woman who thought that being a lady was not inconsistent with working hard. Dirtiness, untidiness, and muddle vex the soul of the real lady far more than doing the work which produces the cleanliness and order. After 3 years at Little Woolston, Miss Pattison made what many must think was the great mistake of her life. Her strong will has already been spoken of. She had found by experience that she could not submit it even to the control of her own father, to whom she was naturally bound by strong feelings of affection. It was necessary to her to have freedom and scope for her energies, and to learn by self-government what she had failed to learn through the government of others. Notwithstanding the incompatibility of her nature with the absolute submission required in such institutions, Miss Pattison joined a High Church sisterhood at Cotham called the Sisterhood of the Good Samaritan. It was part of the discipline of the sisterhood to require unquestioning obedience to all commands. The reason, the feelings, the natural piety of the novices were completely subordinated to obedience as their first and paramount duty. By way of training in unquestioning obedience, Sister Dora, as she was now called, was subjected to various tests of submissiveness. One day, for instance, after she had made all the beds, they were pulled to pieces again by the order of the superior, and she was told to make them again. In some institutions of this kind, after the floor has been carefully and thoroughly scrubbed by a novice, someone enters by order of the superior with mud or ashes and purposely makes it dirty again. The novice is then ordered to return to her work and scrub the floor once more, and she is expected to do so without showing the least sign of disappointment or annoyance. It may be true that this system fosters the habit of unquestioning obedience, but if so, it must be at the expense of other and more valuable qualities. This unnatural system is perverting to the moral sense and judgment, as Sister Dora, a few years later, found to her cost. In 1865, she was sent by the sisterhood to Walsall to take part in the nursing in a small cottage hospital. Towards the end of the year, she received orders from the sisterhood to leave this work and take work as a nurse in a private case in the south of England. Walsall had not been trained to the habits of unquestioning obedience. Its inhabitants and the managers of the little hospital had already discovered Sister Dora's fine qualities as a nurse. They resisted the order that would have deprived them of her services. While negotiations on the subject were proceeding between the Walsall people and the sisterhood at Cotham, news reached Miss Pattison from Hauxwell to say that her father was dangerously ill and much desired to see her. She telegraphed to the sisterhood, telling them of her father's serious illness, and asking permission to visit him. The answer, which was returned almost immediately, was a blank refusal, and she was bidden to proceed at once to Devonshire to nurse a stranger. Incredible as this may seem, it is still more incredible that the order was obeyed. Miss Pattison had not escaped the paralysis of moral sense which this cast-iron system produces. She turned her back on her home and proceeded to Devonshire. Her father died almost immediately, without ever seeing his daughter again. The shock of this event roused Sister Dora from the lethargy from which she had suffered. She was almost broken-hearted, and deeply resented the dictation to which she had been subjected. She ought to have seen, and probably did see, that the will, like all other powers of the mind and body, with which each one of us is endowed, is given to us to be used. We are responsible for its right use, and when we use it wrongly, as she did in this case, for it must have needed a very strong effort of will to resist the appeal of love and duty, it is we ourselves who must bear the punishment and endure the anguish of our fault. She did not immediately sever her connection with the sisterhood, but she began from that time to be less completely in thraldom to it. She finally quitted it in 1875, under circumstances which have not been made public. When a friend questioned her as to the cause, Sister Dora's only reply was, "I am a woman and not a piece of furniture." After her father's death, Sister Dora returned to Walsall, and in this place practically the whole of the rest of her life was devoted to the service of the sick and of all who were desolate and oppressed. She plunged into her work with all the greater eagerness from her desire to forget herself and the many inward troubles and anxieties which oppressed her at this time. Her great desire was to become a first-rate surgical nurse. Walsall has been described by those who lived there as one of the smokiest dens of the Black Country, and the workers in the various factories of the locality were often frightfully injured by accidents with the machinery or by burns and scalds. Sister Dora became marvelously skillful in what is known as conservative surgery, that is, the art of saving a maimed or crushed limb instead of cutting it off. A good old doctor at the hospital taught her all he knew, but she outgrew his instructions, and Miss Lonsdale gives an instance of a case in which Sister Dora saved a man's right arm from amputation, in spite of the doctor's strongly expressed opinion that the man would die unless his arm were taken off immediately. The arm was frightfully torn and twisted. The doctor said it must be taken off, or mortification would set in. Sister Dora said she could save the arm and the man's life, too. The patient was appealed to, and of the two risks he chose the one offered by the sister. The doctor did not fail, proud as he was of his pupil, to remind her that the responsibility of what he considered the patient's certain death would be on her head. She accepted the responsibility, and devoted herself to her patient almost night and day for 3 weeks, with the result that the arm was saved. The doctor was the first generously to acknowledge her triumph, and he brought the rest of his medical colleagues to see what Sister Dora had done. The patient's gratitude was unbounded. He often revisited the hospital simply to inquire for Sister Dora. He was known in the neighborhood as Sister's Arm. During an illness she had, this man used to walk every Sunday morning 11 miles to the hospital to inquire for her. He would say, "How's Sister?" and on receiving a reply would add, "Tell her it's her arm that rang the bell," and walk back again. Sister Dora used to say, when speaking of her period of suspense and anxiety in this case, "How I prayed over that arm." She was particularly skillful in her treatment of burns. Sometimes she would take 2 poor little burnt or scalded babies to sleep in her own room. Those who have had experience in the surgical wards of hospitals know what an overpowering, sickening smell proceeds from burnt flesh. Sister Dora never seemed for a moment to think of herself, or of what was disagreeable or disgusting in such cases as these. In one frightful accident, in which 11 poor men were so badly burned that they resembled charred logs of wood more than human beings, nearly all the doctors and nurses became sick and faint a few minutes after they entered the ward where the sufferers lay, and were obliged to leave. Among the nurses, Sister Dora alone remained at her post, and never ceased, night or day, for 10 days, to do all that human skill could suggest to alleviate the sufferings of the poor victims. Some died almost immediately. Some lingered for a week or 10 days. Only 2 ultimately recovered. Her wonderful courage was shown not only in her readiness to accept responsibility, but in the way in which she was able to keep up her own spirits and to raise the spirits of the patients through such a time of trial as this. She would laugh and joke and tell the sick folks stories, or do anything that would help them to while away the time and bear their sufferings with fortitude and courage. She made her patients feel how much she cared for them, and that all she did for them was a pleasure, not a trouble. She used to provide them with a little bell, which she told them to ring when they wanted her. One poor man was reproached by the other patients for ringing his bell so often, especially as when Sister Dora arrived and asked him what he wanted, he not infrequently answered that he did not know. But Sister Dora never reproached him for ringing too often. "Never mind," she would say brightly, "for I like to hear it." And she told him that she often fancied when she was asleep that she heard his little bell, and started up in a hurry to find it was only a dream. She was so gay and bright and pleasant in her ways, giving her patients comical nicknames, and caressing and coaxing them, almost as a mother would a sick child, that they regarded her with a deep love and veneration that frequently influenced them for good all the rest of their lives. Twice, while she was at Walsall, there were frightful epidemics of smallpox, and on both occasions she showed extraordinary courage and devotion. She did not bear any charm against infection, and in fact generally caught anything that was to be caught in the way of infectious disease. Her courage, therefore, did not proceed from any confidence in her own immunity from danger. She deliberately counted the cost, and resolved to pay it, for the sake of carrying on her work. At the first outbreak of smallpox in Walsall, there was no proper hospital accommodation for the patients, and Sister Dora nursed many of them in the overcrowded courts and alleys where they lived. She was called in to one poor man who was dying of a virulent form of the malady known as black pox. He was a frightful object. All his friends and relations, except one woman, had forsaken him. When Sister Dora arrived, she found there was only one small piece of candle in the house. So she gave the woman money to go out and buy candles and other necessaries. The temptation was too much for the poor woman, who must after all have been better than the patient's other relatives and neighbors, for she had stayed with him when they had all run away. But when the professional nurse arrived and gave her money, she ran away too, and Sister Dora was left quite alone with the dying man. Just as the one bit of candle flickered out, the poor man, covered as he was with this terrible disease, raised himself in bed and said, "Kiss me, sister." She did so, and the man sank back. She promised that she would not leave him while he was alive, and his last hours were soothed by her presence. She passed hours by his side in total darkness, uncertain whether he were dead or alive. At last the grey light of early dawn came, and she was at liberty. Her promise was fulfilled. The man was dead. At the second outbreak of smallpox at Walsall, hospital accommodation was provided for the patients, and the ambulance, a sort of omnibus fitted up to convey a patient and nurse, was frequently to be seen in the streets. Sister Dora was as strong as she was courageous. She would come to a house where a smallpox patient lay, and say she had come for so-and-so. Resistance and excuses were no good. She would take the patient, man or woman, in her arms, as easily as she would a baby, and carry the burden down to the ambulance. Her presence cheered the whole town, and prevented the spread of that dastardly panic which sometimes comes over a place which is stricken by disease. An eyewitness described how everyone in the town felt new courage at the sight of the ambulance and Sister Dora, with her jolly face smiling out of the window. She spent 6 months at the smallpox hospital in 1875, and for a long time she was practically alone there with the patients. The doctors, of course, came by day, and 3 of her old patients constantly visited the hospital for the sake of seeing if they could do anything for her, and there were 2 nearly helpless old women from the workhouse who were supposed to do part of the work. But she was absolutely alone as regards regular skillful assistance in the nursing and other work. The porter did what he could, showing his devotion by getting up early to scrub and clean for her, but he could hardly ever resist the temptation to go off on the drink whenever his wages were paid. On these occasions he would absent himself for 24 hours at a time. Once when this happened, and Sister Dora was quite alone, a delirious patient, a tall, powerful man, flung himself out of bed in the middle of the night and rushed to the door, trying to make his escape. She had no time for hesitation, but at once grappled with him, all covered as he was with the loathsome disease. She got him back to bed and held him there by main force till the doctor arrived in the morning. One of the trials of her work was that the smallpox patients were nearly all alive with vermin. Added to this was the horror of the all-pervading smell of pox. In a letter to a friend, Sister Dora spoke of this, and said it was impossible to get away from it. "I taste it in my tea." For months she never had her bonnet on, or went even as far as the gate, and yet she was able to look back on the time she spent in this hospital as one that had been very much blessed to her. With her high church feelings about Lent, she wrote cheerfully in the letter already quoted, Is not this a glorious retreat for me in Lent? I can have no idle chatter." In another letter she wrote, "I am still a prisoner, surrounded by my lepers. I do feel so thankful that I came. I thank God daily for my life here." Endless instances might be given of her physical and moral courage. Once, when she was in a third-class railway carriage with a lot of rough navvies who were swearing and using horrible language, she boldly reproved them. They laid hands on her, one of them exclaiming, "Hold your jaw, you fool, do you want your face smashed in?" She remained quite calm, not struggling, although they were holding her down on the seat between them. When the train reached a station, they let her go, and she got out of the carriage, and one of the men begged her pardon, saying, "Shake hands, Mum. You're a good plucked one, you are. You were right, and we were wrong." Another time in the hospital, a half-drunken man, flashily dressed, rang the bell in the night, and on the door being opened, forced his way into the hall and demanded a bed. The night nurse on duty was unable to get rid of him, and Sister Dora was summoned. The man reiterated his determination to stay all night, and Sister Dora contented herself with barring his access to the patients by standing erect on the last step of the stairs, with her arms spread from the wall to the balusters. The man seated himself opposite to her, the nurse fled shrieking, and the two waited, staring at one another, each hoping the other would be the first to tire of the situation. Presently the man made a rush down the passage towards the kitchen door, but Sister Dora was too quick for him, and by the time he had reached it, she was there with her arms spread across it, as on the stairs, to bar his way. She expected he would knock her down, but instead of doing so, he muttered some compliment to her courage, turned on his heel, and left the place. She had a very strong personal influence for good on the poor rough people, both men and women, for whom she worked. Her religion was one more of deeds than of words, and they saw that both in word and deed it was genuine. Many a one has dated a new start in life from the time he came under her care. Sometimes patients, waking in the night, would find her praying by their bedsides, and it touched them deeply to see how sincerely and truly she cared for them. Although she had the hearty sense of fun already alluded to, no man could ever venture on a coarse word or jest in her presence, and she inspired a good tone in the wards, even when they were occupied by the roughest and poorest. As time went on, there was hardly a slum or court in the lowest part of Walsall where she was not known, and hardly a creature in the town that did not feel he owed something to her. Although most of her time was given to healing bodily troubles, all her patients felt that she cared for something higher in them than their bodies. She joined heartily in several missions that were started with the object of reaching the lowest and most outcast. She would go quite fearlessly at midnight into the haunts of the most degraded men and women of the town, and induce them, for a while at least, to pause and consider what their lives had been given to them for. Once, we are told, when she was on her way to a patient's house at night, she had to pass through one of the worst slums of the town. A man ran out of a notorious public house and said, "Sister, you're wanted. They've been fighting, and a man's hurt desperate." Even she hesitated momentarily, and the thought passed through her mind that she might be murdered. But her hesitation did not last sufficiently long to be visible. She followed the man immediately, taking comfort, characteristically, in the thought, "What does it matter if I am murdered?" To her astonishment, as soon as she reached the group of men, brutalized apparently almost below the level of humanity, a way was respectfully made for her, and every hat was taken off as she passed to the side of the wounded man. But the time was approaching when the hand of death was to be laid upon this wonderful woman, in the midst of all her labours. She was only about 44 years of age, when she discovered that she was stricken by an incurable and terribly painful disease. It was a sign both of her strength and of her weakness that she insisted on keeping this fact absolutely secret. She, who had always been so strong, could not bear to acknowledge that her strength had come to an end. She, who had been so ready to give sympathy, could not bear to accept it. She went on with her work, bearing her pain silently and proudly, and admitting no one to her confidence. In order more completely to conceal her illness, she left Walsall for a time, and those who remained in charge of the hospital did not dream but that her absence was merely temporary. With the knowledge that her days on earth were numbered, she still went on studying her profession. She attended some of Professor Lister's operations in London in order to become acquainted with his antiseptic process, and she went to the Paris exhibition especially to study the surgical appliances shown there. Then presently she came back to Walsall in October 1878. In November of the same year the mayor opened a new hospital in her name. She was too ill to be present. Up to the last the townspeople could not believe that their dear lady was really to be taken from them, especially as her vitality was so strong that she rallied again and again, when those about her thought the end was near at hand. She never lost her old habit of joking and making fun out of the dismal circumstances of sickness. Her arm, which became terribly swollen and helpless, she nicknamed Sir Roger, and she laughed at her doctors because she lived longer than they had predicted she would. She quite chuckled over the idea that she had done the doctor again. Her life was prolonged till 24th December 1878. The grief throughout the district when it was known that death had removed her was overpowering. The veneration and gratitude of the whole town found expression in many schemes for memorials in her honour. The working people wished most of all for a statue of their dear lady. Their wish was gratified, through Miss Lonsdale's generous aid, in the autumn of 1886. A pure white marble statue now stands in a central position of the smoky town of Walsall, commemorating the life and labours of one of the best of this generation of Englishwomen. Her work is another illustration of the text, "He that is greatest among you shall be your servant." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Some Eminent Women of Our Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT. Chapter 20. Mrs. Barbauld. Anne Letitia Barbauld will probably be more remembered for what she was than for what she did. At a time when women's education was at a very low ebb, and when for a woman to be an authoress was to single herself out for ungenerous sneers, attacks, and insinuations, Mrs. Barbauld did much to raise the social esteem in which literary women were held, and prove in her own person that a popular authoress could be a devoted wife, daughter, and sister. Mrs. Barbauld's father was the Reverend John Aikin, a doctor of divinity, much esteemed in nonconformist circles for his learning and piety. He was for nearly 30 years the head of a well-known nonconformist college at Warrington, round which a little knot of learned and good men gathered, who, it is said, did much to raise the tone, intellectually and morally, of English society, at a time when Oxford and Cambridge were sunk in the deepest lethargy, and had comparatively no influence for good in any direction. Among the men, whose names afterwards became honourably known, who were connected with the social or educational life of the Warrington Academy, may be mentioned Dr. Priestley, Dr. Enfield, the Reverend Gilbert Wakefield, Howard the philanthropist, and Roscoe the historian. In the midst of a society tempered by such good influences as these, Anne Letitia Aikin grew from girlhood to womanhood. She and her brother, John Aikin, 4 years younger than herself, were the only children of their parents. She was born at Kibworth, in Leicestershire, on 20th June 1743, where her father had a school before he became the head of the Warrington Academy. Her mother is said to have come to the singular conclusion that a girl brought up in a boys' school must either be a prude or a tomboy, and Mrs. Aikin preferred the former. Judging from a cameo portrait of Mrs. Barbauld, taken at the request of her friend Josiah Wedgwood, she certainly looks as if a good deal of her time had been spent in the enunciation of the words prunes, prisms, and propriety. But appearances are notoriously deceptive, and there is a nice little story of Mrs. Barbauld's girlhood, which shows that her excellent mother did not succeed in entirely eradicating the tomboy element from her daughter's character. When only 15 years old, Anne had attracted the affections of a Kibworth farmer, who made a formal application to Dr. Aikin for his daughter's hand. The doctor, seeing his daughter in the garden, gave the suitor leave to go and try his fortunes. When she understood the nature of his errand, her embarrassment was very great, for the dilemma presented itself of having to say no, and yet to spare the feelings of the swain. Finding no other way out of the difficulty, she ran up a tree, thus gaining the top of the garden wall, and then, by one spring, the lane on the other side, leaving her discomfited lover to admire her agility and bewail its results. Anne was from her birth an extraordinarily precocious child. Her mother wrote of her in after years, comparing her with some less wonderful grandchildren. I once indeed knew a little girl who was as eager to learn as her instructors could be to teach her, and who at 2 years old could read sentences and little stories in her wise book, roundly, without spelling, and in half a year more could read as well as most women. But I never knew such another, and I believe never shall. Her father shared sufficiently in the prejudices of the period to refuse for a long time to impart to this gifted child any of the classical learning of which he was the master, and in which she ardently desired to share. At length she so far overcame his scruples that she became able to read Latin with facility and gained some acquaintance with Greek. The fact that her father was a schoolmaster no doubt enabled her to enjoy many opportunities of instruction and education to which the bulk of English women at that time were complete strangers. At a time when it was thought enough education for most women, if they were able to read, and perhaps to write their names or so, it is not surprising if schoolmasters' daughters enjoyed an advantage in being able at least to pick up the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Anne was 30 years of age before she made her first appearance in print, with a volume of verse in 1773, but she appears to have been known as a poet in her own circle of friends a few years earlier than this, as there is a letter in existence from Dr. Priestley, dated 1769, in which he asks permission to send a copy of her poem, called Corsica, to Boswell, who was destined to future immortality as the biographer of Dr. Johnson. Her first printed volume was highly successful, and passed through 4 editions almost immediately. Thus encouraged, Anne and her brother shortly afterwards printed a joint volume called Miscellaneous Pieces in Prose, which also attracted much attention and commendation. In Roger's Table Talk, an anecdote is given about this volume which illustrates the amusing mistakes sometimes arising from joint authorship. The various articles in the book were not signed by their respective authors, and on one occasion Charles James Fox, meeting John Aikin at a dinner party, wished to compliment him on his book. "I particularly admire," he said, "your essay, Against Inconsistency in Our Expectations." "That," replied Aikin, "is my sister's." "I much like," returned Fox, "your essay on monastic institutions." "That," answered Aikin, "is also my sister's." Fox thought it best to say no more about the book. In the same year as that of the publication of this volume of essays, 1774, Anne Letitia Aikin became the wife of the Reverend Rochemont Barbauld, a descendant of a French Protestant family. Mr. Barbauld's father had been chaplain to the Electress of Hesse Castle, a daughter of George II., and the son had been intended for the Church of England. He had, however, conscientious objections to taking orders in that church, and joined the Presbyterian body. Miss Aikin was warned before her marriage that her future husband had suffered already from an attack of insanity, but with quixotic devotion this only seemed to her an additional reason why she should unite her life with his. Her married life, notwithstanding many good qualities on her husband's part, was one of exceptional trial and loneliness. Mr. Barbauld was liable throughout his life to fits of insanity, which took the form of fierce and uncontrollable fury as often as not directed against his wife. They settled at Palgrave in Suffolk, and opened a boys' school there. Mrs. Barbauld was much urged by her friend, Mrs. Montague, to open a school for girls, for the purpose of imparting to them, in a regular manner, various branches of science, such as did not then form an ordinary part of women's education. Mrs. Barbauld declined the task, giving various excuses, such as her own want of proficiency in music and dancing and other feminine accomplishments. It may, however, be not improbable that her real reason was one that could not be avowed, and was to be found in the mental condition of her husband. It must have been a sufficiently severe trial to the strongest nerves to keep a boys' school, and to know that the headmaster and principal teacher was at any time liable to fits of insane fury. But this would have been even worse. It would have been a fatal objection in a girls' school. Poor Mrs. Barbauld set herself with pathetic resolution to make the best of the partner and the life she had chosen. She seems immediately to have assumed she would never have any children of her own, for within a year of her marriage she adopted from his birth her nephew Charles, her brother's son. This was the little Charles from whom the early lessons and hymns in prose were written. Very few educational books for young children had then been written, and Mrs. Barbauld set herself to supply the deficiency. She discovered from practical experience the sort of books children learn best from, and the kind of paper and type that suited them best. Many of her friends in the literary world thought she was wasting her talents in such employment. Dr. Johnson is recorded in Boswell's Life to have spoken very scornfully of what she was doing, and set it all down to her having married a little Presbyterian parson. It appears, however, in the anecdotes of Johnson, collected by Mrs. Thrale, that though he might have spoken in this way at times, his warm heart did not fail to appreciate the devotion of Mrs. Barbauld's talents to the humble tasks which her marriage had rendered necessary. Mrs. Barbauld, Mrs. Thrale wrote, had his best praise and deserved it. No man was more struck than Mr. Johnson with the voluntary descent from possible splendor to painful duty. She wrote herself in her preface to The Early Lessons, "The task is humble but not mean, for to lay the first stone of a noble building and to plant the first idea in a human mind can be no dishonor to any hand." The school at Palgrave was successful mainly through Mrs. Barbauld's efforts. Among the scholars were reckoned many men of future distinction, such as the first Lord Denman and William Taylor of Norwich. After 11 years of courageous and exhausting work, the school was given up, and Mr. Barbauld undertook the charge of a Presbyterian church at Hampstead. The husband and wife here enjoyed the friendship of Joanna Baillie and her sister, and here some of Mrs. Barbauld's best literary work was done. But the terrible malady which had pursued her husband throughout his life continued to darken their existence. In order to be near her brother and enjoy the protection and solace of his society, Mrs. Barbauld left Hampstead in 1802, and removed to Stoke Newington, where Dr. Aikin then lived. But Mr. Barbauld's mania continued to increase, and after a sudden attack which he made upon his wife with a dinner knife, it became obvious that he must be put under restraint. The unhappy man put an end to his own life in 1808. After an interval, Mrs. Barbauld resumed her literary work, bringing out an edition of English novels in 1810. In the following year she brought out a poem, which she called 1811, very strongly tinged with the despondency which she felt regarding public affairs. She had been bred as a Whig to hope for great things from the measures of emancipation with which that party had always been identified. Her sympathies were rather with the French Revolution than with the long-continued struggle of England against Napoleon. The poem had a tone of gloom and deep melancholy, which perhaps reflected more of the writer's personal despondency than the circumstances justified. It is not a little curious that a passage in it is credited with having suggested Lord Macaulay's famous prophecy that in years to come a New Zealander will from a broken arch of Blackfriars Bridge contemplate the ruins of St. Paul's. The poem provoked a coarse and insulting review in the Quarterly, with which it is to be regretted that Southey's name is now identified. Murray, the proprietor of the review, is said to have declared that he was more ashamed of that article than of any that had ever appeared in his magazine. Mrs. Barbauld's friends, Miss Edgeworth foremost among them, expressed their indignation and sympathy. A more ungentlemanlike, unjust, and insolent review Miss Edgeworth said she had never read, and she wrote an inspiriting letter to her friend, concluding with the words, "Write on, shine out, and defy them." But at nearly 70 years of age, Mrs. Barbauld was to be excused if she felt that younger and stronger hands must carry on the fight. The poem referred to was not her last literary effort, but it was the last of her writings published during her lifetime. Very little, perhaps, of her work has permanent value. One poem, however, that beginning, "Life, I know not what thou art," which was written in extreme old age, will probably live as long as anything in the language. It indicates possibly what she might have done had it not been for the tragedy of her married life. Of two lines in this poem, "Life, we've been long together, through pleasant and through cloudy weather," Wordsworth declared that, though he was not in the habit of grudging people their good things, he wished he had written those lines. Her mental powers remained clear and vigorous to the end of her long life. When she was past 80, writing to Miss Edgeworth, she summed up, as it were, the worth of what she knew and did not know. "I find that many things I knew I have forgotten. Many things I thought I knew, I find I knew nothing about. Some things I know, I have found not worth knowing, and some things I would give, oh, what would one not give to know, are beyond the reach of human ken." All her life through she labored with her pen in defense of civil and religious liberty, against the iniquities of the slave trade, and for many other causes which have made life more worth living in England today. She died, universally honored and respected, in 1825, aged 82. End of section 20.
Chapter 21 of Some Eminent Women of Our Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Thomas, Waterlooville, UK. Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT. Chapter 21. Mrs. Joanna Baillie, as she was usually called, because though she was never married, her age and literary reputation were held to entitle her to brevet rank, was a remarkable instance of a writer rapidly rising to the highest pinnacle of fame, and then as rapidly and surely descending almost to the common level of ordinary mortals. But the Scotchwoman, with the blood of heroes in her veins, showed herself worthy of the descent, both by the modesty and dignity with which she bore her fame, and by the sweetness and unassuming simplicity with which she bore the loss of it. She was descended from Sir William Wallace, and the fame of this long-past ancestor is perhaps equalled by that of another and much nearer relative. John Hunter, the great anatomist and physiologist, the founder of the College of Surgeons, was her mother's brother. She therefore might truly feel, not in a figurative sense, that everything she was sprung of earth's first blood, and her double connection with the best and greatest of the heroes of Scotland was probably not without its influence on the development of her mind and character. She was born at Bothwell near Glasgow on the banks of the Clyde in 1762. In a poem addressed near the close of her life to her sister Agnes, she recalls how they had, as children, paddled barefoot side by side among the sunny shallows of the Clyde. Her father was a minister of the Scotch Church and afterwards a professor of divinity in the University of Glasgow. His death in 1778 and the establishment of his son Matthew in the medical profession in London caused Mrs. Baillie and her daughters, Joanna and Agnes, to remove there in 1784, and in London practically the rest of the future poetess's long life was spent. Her first work was a volume of verse published anonymously in 1790. The first of her series of dramas, called Plays on the Passions, was published in 1798. They were also published without author's name. They made an immediate and very widespread impression, and their author was frequently, and by the very best judges, lauded as being equal, if not superior, to Shakespeare. The idea of these dramas, and of those in the successive volumes which appeared in 1802 and 1812, was to delineate a single dominant passion, such as hatred, envy, etc., and each of the passions thus treated was made the subject first of a tragedy, then a comedy. The language employed is easy, dignified and simple, and it is probable that the contrast Joanna Baillie's dramas afforded in this respect to the dramas of the generation closing with the death of Dr. Johnson was the reason of the great hold which they at once obtained upon the public mind. It is not easy in any other way to account for their extraordinary popularity. The time in which Joanna Baillie lived was one marked by a literary revolution, in which the formal, stilted, didactic manner was overthrown and poets and great writers sought to express their thoughts in simple and natural language. The leaders of this literary revolution were Wordsworth and Coleridge. In the great movement identified with their names, Joanna Baillie bore a humbler but a useful and effective part. When Joanna Baillie's first volume of plays appeared, there was much speculation as to their possible authorship. Samuel Rogers, the banker, poet and critic, thought that they were written by a man. It seems to have been difficult at the end of the last century for the great judges in the literary world to conceive that a poem, worthy of praise, could be of female authorship. Even so late as 1841, a writer in the Quarterly Review, writing upon Joanna Baillie's poetical works, puts the coping stone upon the praise which he bestows upon her style and diction by saying that they are masculine. He says, "Let us again express our admiration of the wonderful elasticity and masculine force of mind exhibited in this vast collection of dramas." And in another place the writer says, "The spirit breathing everywhere is a spirit of manly purity and moral uprightness." We should say, at the present day, that there is certainly force of mind in Joanna Baillie's dramas, but that it is feminine, not masculine in character, and that the spirit of purity which breathes through them is essentially the womanly spirit. She had particularly power and skill in the delineation of female characters, especially those of an unusual degree of elevation and purity. This in itself would have been sufficiently betrayed the sex of the writer now, when the people had far wider opportunities of judging of the differences between men and women as authors. Thackeray could give us Ethel Newcome and a Becky Sharp, but women were needed to give us Dorothea and Marianne Earle or a Shirley Keeldar. Mrs. Siddons, the great actress, was charmed by the character of Jane de Montfort in Joanna Baillie's Tragedy on Hatred. The play, called De Montfort, was put upon the stage by John Kemble, the brother of Mrs. Siddons. They both appeared in it. It ran for 11 nights but was not successful on stage. Joanna's complete ignorance of what was requisite for the success of a play upon the stage foredoomed her to failure. The audience was, in the first act, let into the secret upon which the plot of the whole play turned. Consequently, as the drama proceeded, the interest in it, instead of becoming more and more intense, gradually dwindled away, until in the fifth act it had quite evaporated. Mrs. Siddons, whose admiration for the character of Jane de Montfort has already been mentioned, is said to have remarked to the poetess, "Make me some more Jane de Montforts," a request which does not appear to have been gratified. In all, 5 of Joanna Baillie's plays were put upon the stage. 2 of them, called Constantine and Valeria and The Family Legend, had a considerable degree of success. The Family Legend was brought out in Edinburgh in 1809 under the special patronage of Sir Walter Scott, who wrote the prologue of the play. At a later date it was reproduced in London. The authorship of Joanna Baillie's first volume of plays did not long remain a secret. Sir Walter Scott was the first to make a successful guess as to the personality of the writer, and the discovery led to the formation of a warm friendship between him and Joanna, which only terminated with his life. Many of Scott's most delightful and characteristic letters were written to her. It was perhaps Scott's too generous appreciation of Joanna's powers as a dramatist that led to her plays being so much overrated, as they certainly were when they first appeared. Scott compared her to Shakespeare. Miss Mitford followed suit, saying of her sister writer, "Her tragedies have a boldness and grasp of mind, a firmness of hand, and resonance of cadence that scarcely seem within the reach of a female writer." Byron made her an exception to his sweeping generalities concerning the female sex, saying, "Women, save Joanna Baillie, cannot write tragedy." In 1825 the golden mists which had surrounded the sunrise of her literary life had melted away. Charles Lamb was too keen a critic probably to have been carried away by the stream of fashion at any time, but in the year mentioned, writing to his friend Bernard Barton, he says, "I think you told me your acquaintance with the drama was confined to Shakespeare and Miss Baillie. Some read only Milton and Crowley. The gap is as from an ananas to a turnip." Lamb's contemptuous reference measures the rapid fall from heights of fame which Joanna Baillie endured, and endured without any failure of sweetness and dignity of character. Joanna Baillie's day as a poetess was of short duration. It is now chiefly as a woman that she charms and helps us. Her house at Hampstead was for many years a meeting place for those who were most worth meeting, either for talent or goodness. Her kind and gentle influence brought out all that was best in her guests and companions. In Miss Martineau's Autobiography, she has something to say about nearly all the lions and lionesses of the literary London of her day, and she singles out our poetess for special commendation. "There was Joanna Baillie," she writes, "whose serene and gentle life was never troubled by the pains and penalties of vanity. What a charming spectacle was she! Mrs. Barbauld's published correspondence tells of her in 1800 as a young lady of Hampstead whom I have visited, and who came to Mr. Barbauld's meeting, all the while with an innocent face as if she had never written a line. That was 2 years before I was born. When I met her about 30 years afterwards, there she was, still as innocent a face as if she had never written a line." And this was after an experience which would have been a bitter trial to an author with a particle of vanity. She had enjoyed fame almost without parallel, and had outlived it. She had been told every day for years through every possible channel that she was second only to Shakespeare, if second. And she had seen her works drop out of notice, so that of the generation who grew up before her eyes, not 1 in 1,000 had read a line of her plays. Yet was her serenity never disturbed, nor her merry humour in the least dimmed. Autobiography, Volume 1, page 385. This serene and happy temperament accompanied Joanna throughout her long life. She went on writing till past 80, and lived to the great age of 89. Her sister Agnes, her inseparable friend and companion, lived to be over 100, and preserved her faculties clearly to the end. Joanna Baillie was never ill. The day before her death she expressed a strong desire to die. She went to bed apparently in her usual health, but was found to be in a state of coma in the morning, and she died on the afternoon of the same day, 23rd of February, 1851. End of chapter 21. Recording by Mark Thomas, Waterlooville, UK.
Chapter number 22 of Some Eminent Women of Our Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Naomi Brewster, Melbourne, Australia. Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT. Chapter number 22. Hannah More. Miss Charlotte M. Young's charming little biography of Hannah More brings strikingly before us a picture of the authoress of Coelebs in Search of a Wife, and also depicts in a way that will not easily be forgotten some of the more striking contrasts between the present day and the England of 80 or 90 years ago. There are some who are always inclined to say the old is better, but they must be very curiously constituted who can look back on the social condition of our country at the end of the last century and beginning of this, without being filled with amazement and thankfulness at the improvement that has taken place. It is not so generally remembered as it ought to be that the second half of Hannah More's life was devoted to the service of the poor, especially to the spread of some measure of education and civilization in the then almost savage districts of the neighbourhood of Cheddar and of the Mendip Hills. Yet even so advanced an educationalist as Hannah More thought that on no account should the poor be taught to write. In a letter to Bishop Beadon, describing her system of instruction for the poor in the parishes immediately under her care, she says, "They learn on weekdays such coursework as may fit them for servants. I allow of no writing for the poor. My object is not to make fanatics, but to train up the lower classes in habits of industry and piety." We cannot have a more apt illustration of the fact that the advanced reformer of one generation may be, by the natural growth of society, the type of what is most exaggeratedly retrograde in the next. It would be very ungenerous and short-sighted on our part to condemn Hannah More for her narrowness of view. She belonged to a day when the farmers in the village, where she sought to establish a Sunday school, begged her to desist because religion would be the ruin of agriculture and had done nothing but mischief ever since it had been brought in by the monks of Glastonbury. At another place her educational schemes were so stoutly opposed by all the leading inhabitants that it was impossible to obtain for the school the shelter of any roof, and the children were accordingly assembled to sing a few hymns under an apple tree. They were soon, however, driven from the shelter by the fears of the owner of the tree, who said he was afraid the hymn singing was Methody, and that Methody had blighted an apple tree belonging to his mother. Even these examples of ignorance and superstition might possibly, however, be matched at the present day. More thoroughly significant of a state of things that is past and gone forever is the following incident. On a Sunday about the year 1790, in the midst of morning service, the congregation in the Bristol churches were startled by the bell and the voice of the crier, proclaiming the reward of a guinea for a poor negro girl who had run away. The idea of property in human beings is one that is now universally abhorrent, but less than 100 years ago the loss of such property could be cried in the midst of congregations assembled to acknowledge the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of humanity, and it was only one here and there among the worshippers who felt the blasphemy and the mockery of the proceeding. As an illustration of the extreme hardships endured by the poor before the era of steam manufacturers had set in, we learn that the difficulty in obtaining clothes was so great that at Brentford, close to London, thrifty parents bought rags by the pound and made clothing for their children by patching the pieces together. Brushes and combs, it was added, were entirely unknown. It is no exaggeration, therefore, to say the poorest beggar of the present day can, if he chose, be more luxuriously clad and cared for than the children of the thrifty poor 100 years ago. The difference in morals is as great as the difference in manners and education. Hannah More heard a charity sermon in which the preacher, a dignified ecclesiastic, propounded that the rich and great should be extremely liberal in their charities, because they were happily exempted from the severer virtues. This was the old papal practice of the sale of indulgences appearing again in a Protestant dress. No wonder, if this was a type of the gospel that was preached to the rich, that Patty, Hannah's sister, was accustomed to say that she had good hope that the hearts of some of the rich poor wretches might be touched by her sister's eloquence. The change of manners may be illustrated by the following anecdote. Hannah More, in the height of her literary celebrity, was asked to sit next to the Bishop of Chester, Dr. Porteous, at dinner, and make him talk. She pressed him to take a little wine. He replied, "I can't drink a little, child, therefore I never touch it. Abstinence is easy to me, temperance would be difficult." These were the days when Edmund Spenser was not considered a poet, and when Dryden and Pope were preferred to Shakespeare. Hannah, however, defended Milton's L'Allegro, Il Penseroso and Lycidas against the strictures of Dr. Johnson, though they found themselves in entire agreement in depreciating Milton's sonnets. Johnson's simile for a sonnet was a bead carved out of a cherry stone. The noble and solemn music of Milton's majestic sonnets certainly did not harmonise with Johnson's image, and therefore, as Milton's sonnets were not pretty playthings, it was agreed that he could not write sonnets. The bigotry and narrowness of religious criticism at that day may be measured by the fact, which Hannah mentions in one of her letters, that her book on practical piety had been attacked by the Calvinists as giving a sanction to idolatry, because she had spoken of the Son as He. She did not altogether escape being tarred with the same brush, if we may judge from the passage in Gnomesb, where she makes Mr. Stanley complain of Days, Sandford and Merton, and other books which had lately been written for the young, that there was no intimation in them of the corruption of human nature, and thus that they contradict the Catechism when it speaks of being born in sin and the children of wrath. She could not help, it appears, make her religion sadly, as English people are supposed to take their pleasures. There was, however, a great fund of natural gaiety and light-heartedness in her, but whether she considered this one of the results of being a child of wrath or not, she did not seem to think gaiety, any more than writing, was a thing to be encouraged in the poor. She describes a great meeting of the schools founded by herself in the Mendip Hills. This annual Mendip feast took the form of what we should now call a gigantic school treat. The schools established were spread over an area of 28 miles, and nearly the whole population of the villages, to the number of 7,000 or 8,000 people, attended. The children were generously regaled on substantial fare, but nothing in the form of a game or festivity of any kind was permitted. The singing of God Save the Queen is the only pleasure in the form of a song we ever allow. The meeting, she says again, took its rise from religious institutions. The day passed in the exercise of duties and closed with joy. Nothing of a gay nature was introduced. One cannot help thinking, on reading this, that she had only herself to thank if, in spite of all her talents and goodness, her name became a byword for severity and primness. Charles Lamb speaks in one of his early letters of out-Hannahing Hannah more, and she herself tells what she states is a true story, illustrating the way in which she was regarded in the circles where childish merriment was not discountenanced. A lady gave a very great children's ball, wrote Miss Hannah, somewhere about 1792. At the upper end of the room, in an elevated place, was dressed out a figure to represent me, with a large rod in my hand, prepared to punish such naughty doings. The pity of this was that her natural disposition seems to have been sprightly and gay enough. Her verses and other compositions often show a very pretty wit. If she had been as merry when she undertook her great work on the Mendips, as she was in the days when she was the friend and constant companion of Garrick, Johnson and Horace Walpole, the general impression left by her character would have been a much more attractive one. Miss Yonge thinks that the chief reason for the austerity of her religion is to be found in the low condition of morals at the time. There was scarcely, she writes, an innocent popular song in existence, simple enough, and unconnected with evil, and the children and their parents were still too utterly rough and uncivilized to make it safe to relax the bonds of restraint for a moment. We cannot think that this excuse is altogether valid. The age that had produced John Gilpin and Goody Two-Shoes can hardly be said to be without one innocent popular song or story which would amuse children. The gloomy complexion given to religion by the school of which Hannah More was a member has a great deal to answer for. In some temperaments, among whom the poet Cowper may be quoted as a type, the gentle and sensitive nature was plunged into profound and morbid melancholy which wrecked the whole existence of its victim. In others, of a more energetic and rebellious nature, it produced a violent reaction, not only against religion, but against all moral order and every kind of restraint. Just as the excesses of the reign of Charles II followed the grim and rigid piety of Puritan England, so the orgies of the Prince Regent and his boon companions followed the austere and mirth-killing religion of the early evangelicals. About the time of which we are now writing, a serious attack was made in one of the religious papers on Jane Taylor, the joint authoress with her sister of Hymns for Infant Minds, because in one of her stories she had represented, without reprobation, a family party of young children enjoying a dance together. When people impute wickedness to actions that are in themselves innocent and harmless, they are tampering with and weakening their own moral sense, and that of all those brought within their influence. To invent sins generally ends in manufacturing sinners. Hannah More, the youngest but one of 5 sisters, daughters of Jacob More, master of the school at Stapleton, near Bristol, was born about 1745. Her father belonged to a Norfolk family, several members of which had been numbered among Cromwell's Ironsides. Jacob More, however, forsook the family traditions both in politics and religion. He became a churchman and a Tory, and this may have been the cause of his leaving the home of his fathers and settling in the West Country. Here he married a farmer's daughter, of whom little is known except that she persuaded her husband to impart his classical and mathematical learning to his clever little daughter, and that by many acts of motherly sympathy she had encouraged her children to use the talents with which nature had very liberally endowed them. The 5 sisters, Mary, Betsy, Sally, Hannah, and Patty, were a tribe of whom any mother might have been proud. Hannah and Patty were inseparable, sharing every hope and every occupation and possession. Their taste was for literature. Sally was the wit of the family. Mary and Betsy supplied the practical housewifely element in the quintet. As a young girl, Hannah's 2 ambitions were to live in a cottage too low for a clock, and to go to London to see bishops and booksellers. At the age of 21, Mary More set up a school on her own account in Bristol. Betsy and Sally were her assistants, and Hannah and Patty were among the first batch of pupils. Sally in after years thus described this adventurous proceeding to her friend Dr. Johnson. "We were born with more desires than guineas. As years increased our appetites, the cupboard at home grew too small to gratify them, and with a bottle of water, a beard, and a blanket, we set out to seek our fortunes. We found a great house with nothing in it, and it was like to remain so, till looking into our knowledge boxes, we happened to find a little larning, a good thing when land is gone, or rather none, and so at last, by giving a little of this larning to those who had none, we got a good store of gold in return." Paragraphs 6 and 7, Miss Yonge's Hannah More. Hannah's unusual abilities soon began to attract notice. She wrote a play for school acting, which had a great success. We are told how on one occasion when she was ill, her health always being delicate, her doctor was so carried away by the charm of her conversation that he forgot to make any inquiries about her health. He took his leave, and was on the point of departing from the house, when he returned with the inquiry, "And how are you, my poor child?" Hannah's first visit to London was about 1772 or 1773, when she was 27 or 28 years old. She saw the first performance of Sheridan's Rivals and sagely remarked that the writer must be treated with indulgence, for that much is to be forgiven an author of 23 whose genius is likely to be his principal inheritance. She was introduced to Miss Reynolds, Sir Joshua's sister, and this lady promised to make her known to Dr. Johnson. She saw Garrick, the great actor, in King Lear, and was so much impressed by him that she wrote a long description of his acting in a letter that was handed about among her friends, and gained a sort of half publicity, as seemed to have been not unusual at that time. This letter paved the way for an introduction to Garrick and his wife, and Hannah More became one of their most intimate and valued friends. Garrick encouraged Hannah to write for the stage, and some of her pieces under his fostering care had an astonishing degree of success. Garrick's favourite name for the poetess was Nine, by way of delicate comparison with the 9 Muses. Horace Walpole used to call her Saint Hannah. Dr. Johnson called her a saucy girl, perhaps the nicest epithet of the 3. When Garrick died, Hannah was one of the ladies admitted to Westminster Abbey to witness his funeral. Hannah spent the first year of her friend's widowhood with Mrs. Garrick at her house near Hampton, and on many other occasions it was shown in a similar way that Hannah was one on whom her friends were accustomed to depend for sympathy and support in the darkest hour of mourning and sorrow. After Garrick's death, Hannah never visited a theatre again. She did not even go to see her own play, The Fatal Falsehood, which Garrick had been preparing to put on the stage at the time of his death. From the time of her first entry into London society, she seems to have had access to all that was best in the world of literature and art, and to have played a distinguished part there. It is therefore the more to her credit that she turned from this gay and brilliant life in order to devote herself to the work of education and civilization among the poor people of Cheddar and the Mendips. She and her sister Patty had settled on a pretty cottage home called Cowslip Green in the parish of Ringdon, Bristol. Here they were visited by their friends from the great world, and hence they, in their turn, made their annual visit to London. Mention has already been made of the painful impression produced in Hannah on hearing, in a Bristol church, the loss of a negro girl proclaimed by the crier in the midst of the morning service. She was a woman much influenced by her friendships. She had been a poetess and dramatist under the influence of Johnson and Garrick. Wilberforce and John Newton, Cowper's friend, had now awakened in her a passion of pity for slaves and a passion of hatred against slavery. Miss Young states that Hannah was before this a friend of Lady Middleton, who had first inspired William Wilberforce with the idea of his great work in life, and on going to make her annual visit to Mrs. Garrick in the winter of 1787, she first heard of the bill that was to be introduced into Parliament for the abolition of slavery. In 1789, William Wilberforce came to spend a few days with the Miss More at Cowslip Green. By way of showing him the beauties of the neighbourhood, the ladies sent him to see the picturesque cliffs and caves of Cheddar. When their guest returned, he was remarkably silent. The food that had been sent with him was untasted, and he remained for some hours alone in his room. His hostesses naturally feared that he was ill, but when he rejoined them they discovered that instead of admiring the natural beauties of Cheddar, the tender heart of the future emancipator of the slaves had been wholly engrossed by the evidences which had presented themselves of human depravity, misery, and neglect. The inhabitants of the picturesque region were almost savages. Their poverty was frightful. There was no sort of attempt at education of any kind. There was no resident clergyman. The people were utterly lawless. It was unsafe for a decent person to go amongst them unprotected. Writs could not be served, but at risk of the constable being thrown down some cliff or pit. These things Wilberforce had discovered, and they obscured for him all the pleasures which pretty scenery could afford. "Miss Moore," he said, "something must be done for Cheddar." And after much consultation and thought, before he went away, he again charged the ladies with the task of civilizing and educating the wild district which lay at their doors, adding, "If you will be at the trouble, I will be at the expense." From this time the sisters led a new life. It is true that Hannah did not give up her literary pursuits. She laboured with her pen as well as with other instruments in pursuit of her end. But now the main object of both Patty and Hannah was to educate and reclaim the inhabitants of the districts which have been named. The work, merely from a physical point of view, was by no means light. There were no roads, or such bad ones that the only practical means of travelling was on horseback. Their first task was to endeavour to gain the goodwill and assistance of the farmers and gentry. Patty says of some of these, "They are as ignorant as the beasts that perish, intoxicated every day before dinner, and plunged into such vice that I begin to think London a virtuous place." Such clergy as did occasionally visit the district might as well have stayed away. Of one Patty says, "Mr. G. is intoxicated about 6 times a week, and very frequently is prevented from preaching by 2 black eyes honestly earned by fighting." The sisters showed their good sense as well as their benevolence by finding out and utilizing whatever in the way of good influence existed in the district. They reject no help because the helper did not conform to their particular pattern of orthodoxy. They did not hesitate, although they were strict churchwomen, to engage a Methodist to act as mistress in one of their Sunday schools. They soon had 13 villages under their care, and an improvement began to be visible in nearly all of them. Of one of them, Congresbury, Hannah wrote describing the first opening of the school. It was an affecting sight. Several of the grown-up youths had been tried at the last assizes. 3 were the children of a person lately condemned to be hanged, many thieves, all ignorant, profane, and vicious beyond belief. Of this banditti we have enlisted 170, and when the clergyman, a hard man, who is also the magistrate, saw these creatures kneeling round us, whom he had seldom seen but to commit or punish in some way, he burst into tears. "I can do them little good, I fear, but the grace of God can do all." The Misses Moore did not escape bitter persecution and misrepresentation in their good work. A Mr. Beer, curate of Wedmore, distinguished himself by his furious hostility to them. He threatened them with penal proceedings for teaching without a licence, induced the farmers to make formal complaint to the Archdeacon against them, and obtained an affidavit of a half-witted young man whom they had befriended, making personal charges against them. Influential friends, however, came to the ladies' assistance. The good bishop said, when he heard it was Hannah More, he knew it was all right. But the persecution they endured was not without its effect on their health and spirits. Hannah was laid up for about 2 years at this time and was unable to pursue her work among her poor scholars. In 1802 the sisters removed from Cowslip Green to Barley Wood, where Hannah wrote some of her best-known books. None of her works is better known, at least by name, than Coelebs in Search of a Wife. Here also, by the request of Queen Charlotte, she wrote a book of advice on the education of Princess Charlotte, who, it was thought, was destined to become Queen of England. The Shepherd of Salisbury Plain was written at Cowslip Green as one of the large series of simple stories for the poor, intended by the sisters to counteract and undersell popular literature of an objectionable character. The Misses Moore produced 3 of these tracts a month, and it is calculated that more than 2 million were sold in a year. By many, The Shepherd of Salisbury Plain was considered Hannah More's masterpiece. Wilberforce said he would rather present himself before heaven with the shepherd in his hand than the Peveril of the Peak. At Barley Wood, Hannah experienced a great and unavoidable calamity of old age, the gradual loss by death of the friends and allies of her youth. Johnson, Burke, Reynolds and Garrick were dead long ago, and the brilliant society in London, of which Hannah had formed part, had lost many of its stars. One by one, death laid its hand on the members of the Moore sisterhood, till Hannah and Patty, the lifelong friends and companions, were the only 2 left. In September 1819, Mr. and Mrs. Wilberforce being on a visit to the sisters, Patty sat up till a late hour of the night talking to her guests of old days, and Hannah's first introduction to London. In the morning, the first news that met the visitors' ears was that Patty was dying. She lingered about a week, but never regained consciousness, and then Hannah was left quite alone, the last of all the 5. But her friends gathered around her, and her vigorous intellect and strong sense of duty did not allow her to be idle. She still had the vivacity enough to write humorous letters and verses, and to poke fun at what she considered the misdirected zeal of some educationalists. A few years before her death, Hannah More removed to Windsor Terrace, Clifton. Her old age was cheered by the companionship of a friend, Miss Froude. She is my domestic chaplain, my house apothecary, knitter and lamplighter, missionary to my numerous and learned seminaries, and without controversy the queen of the clubs, penny clubs. When an old lady of more than 80 can write in this buoyant strain, it is more to be regretted that she seems to have thought gaiety was a thing that was dangerous to encourage a taste for in the poor. Still, though we cannot help regretting this, we shall do well if we can imitate, in however humble a degree, her unselfish devotion to the goodness and the way in which she spent the best years of her life in trying to improve the lot of the most destitute and miserable of her neighbours. She lived to be 88. She had no long illness, and no failure of any of her mental faculties, except that of memory. Her body became gradually weaker, and she longed for death. One day she stretched out her arms, crying, "Patty, joy!" She never spoke again, dying a few hours later, on 7th September 1833. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Some Eminent Women of Our Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT. Chapter 23, The American Abolitionists, Prudence Crandall and Lucretia Mott. Everybody is an abolitionist now. There is not, probably, in any part of Europe or the United States, a single human being who would now defend slavery as an institution, or who thinks that for man to own property in his fellow man, to be able to buy and sell him and dispose of his whole life, is not a sin and an outrage against all feelings of humanity. Slavery was put an end to in the British dominions nearly 70 years ago, but it is only 26 years since it was abolished in the United States of America. The time is well within the memory of many persons now living, when to be an abolitionist, even in the New England states, was to be hated and reviled, to render oneself the object of the bitterest persecution, to risk comfort, happiness, and even life. In England, the abolitionist party was headed by men like Wilberforce, Clarkson, Macaulay, and Buxton, who all enjoyed the advantages belonging to education, good social position, and comparative wealth. It was always respectable in England to be an abolitionist, and it was not necessary to possess the courage and devotion of a martyr to declare one's hatred of slavery. But in the United States it was quite otherwise. Great and influential people of all parties there were for many years vehemently opposed to the emancipation of the slaves. Even as late as 1841, Miss Martineau describes the great sensation made among the elite of intellectual Boston when they found that Lord Morpeth, afterwards the Earl of Carlisle, who was then on a visit to the United States of America, had openly expressed his sympathy with the principles of the abolitionists. In 1835, the Boston mob dragged William Lloyd Garrison, the leader of the American abolitionists, through the streets with a rope around his neck, and his life was only saved from their fury through the stratagem of the mayor, who committed him to jail as a disturber of the peace. In 1841, the feeling against the abolitionists was a little less violent, but anti-slavery opinions were at that time in deep disrepute in the United States. They were vulgar, and those who held them were not noticed in society, and were insulted and injured as often as possible by genteeler people and more complacent Republicans. It was a matter of great astonishment to the polite world of Boston that the English aristocrat made no secret of the fact that he shared the opinions of these despised and hated abolitionists. In 1828, Garrison was a poor lad, working for his living as a printer. He determined to devote himself to the gigantic task of freeing his country from the curse of slavery. He began to print with his own hands and publish an anti-slavery paper called The Liberator. He wandered up and down the United States as an anti-slavery lecturer. By and by, a few friends began to gather round him, and those who shared his principles and his enthusiasm gradually made themselves known to him. In 1833, being then 28 years old, he received a letter from a young Quaker lady, Miss Prudence Crandall, who asked his advice under the following circumstances. 2 years previously, she had bought a large house at Canterbury in the state of Connecticut, and had started there a boarding school for girls. She had flourished beyond her expectations, and had every prospect of forming a highly successful school. She wrote to Garrison and asked his advice about changing her white scholars for colored ones. She says in her letter, very simply, not giving herself any airs of martyrdom, "I have been for some months past determined, if possible, during the remainder of my life, to benefit the people of color." Under these quiet words lay a firmness of purpose that would have supported her to the stake if need were. She did not on that occasion tell Garrison that she had already admitted to her classes, not as a boarder but as a day scholar, a very respectable young Negro woman whose family she knew well as members of the church which she herself attended. By this action she had given great offense to the genteel inhabitants of Canterbury. The wife of an Episcopal clergyman who lived in the town told her that if she retained that colored girl, the school would be ruined. Prudence replied that though the school might be ruined, she would not turn her scholar out. She soon discovered that many of her pupils would leave not to return if the colored girl were retained, but this did not shake her resolution. She began to consider whether it would not be possible to have a school for colored girls only, and upon this point, not saying anything of her own sacrifices, she wrote, as before mentioned, to consult Garrison. Very soon after the date of this letter, the Liberator newspaper contained an advertisement stating that Miss P. Crandall, a white lady of Canterbury, Connecticut, had opened a high school for young colored ladies and misses. By this time the town of Canterbury had put itself into the greatest state of excitement about Miss Crandall's project. She might have reasonably thought that when she had converted her school into one for young colored ladies and misses only, that so long as she and her pupils and their parents were satisfied, no one else had any concern in the matter. But this was not the view taken by the inhabitants of Canterbury. 3 towns meetings were summoned in 1 week to consider what measures could be taken to stop and thwart her project. At first it seems to have been thought desirable to try the fair means of persuasion, and Miss Crandall was waited on by a deputation of leading gentlemen of the place, who professed to feel a real regard for the colored people, and a perfect willingness that they should be educated, provided it could be effected in some other place. Miss Crandall's scheme of educating them in her own house in Canterbury would, they assured her, bring disgrace and ruin on the whole town. Miss Crandall heard them out, and then announced her determination to carry out her plan. There was an immovable firmness under the tranquillity of the young Quakeress's demeanour. Another town's meeting was called, and Miss Crandall was allowed to be represented by counsel, but the gentlemen who took up her cause were not granted a hearing, on the ground that they were outsiders, not natives of the town, and the whole town of Canterbury, in public meeting assembled, then proceeded to vote their unanimous disapprobation of the school, and their fixed determination to oppose it at all hazards. They certainly opposed it with great vigour, but the hazard was not so much to the town of Canterbury as to the young woman, who was the object for 2 years of the most relentless persecution. She all the while maintained her quiet dignity, causing Garrison to exclaim in a letter to a friend, "Wonderful woman, as undaunted as if she had the whole world on her side. She has opened her school and is resolved to persevere." One of her friends wrote to Garrison, "We shall have a rough time, probably, before the year is out. The struggle will be great, no doubt, but God will redeem the captives. We are all determined to sustain Miss Crandall, if there is law in the land to protect her. She is a noble soul." The fight between the heroic little Quaker woman and the town of Canterbury soon waxed very hot. Almost directly after the school was opened in 1833, her enemies procured the passing of an act by the state legislature of Connecticut, prohibiting private schools for non-resident colored persons, and providing for the expulsion of such scholars. The fact is a warning of the way in which small local parliaments may be carried away by local passions. Such an act would probably even then never have passed the legislature of the United States. As it was, its originators must have been ashamed of it as soon as their rage against Miss Crandall had had time to cool, for it was repealed in 1838. But in the 5 years during which it was in operation, it gave Miss Crandall's enemies great power over her. Under this act she was twice arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. She appealed to the Supreme Court, and had the satisfaction in the Superior Tribunal of defeating her persecutors, though only on a technical point of law. But in the interval she was subjected to the most extraordinary and inhuman persecution. There was not a shopkeeper in the town who would sell her or any member of her household a morsel of food. She and her scholars were not admitted to take part in public worship. No public conveyance would take them as passengers. Doctors would not attend them. Miss Crandall's own relations and friends were warned that if they valued their own safety they must not visit her or have anything to do with her. Her well was filled with manure, and water from other sources was refused. The house itself was smeared with filth, assailed with rotten eggs and stones, and finally set on fire. See Life of William Lloyd Garrison, Volume 1, page 321. But the little schoolmarm held her own. Unlike that Frenchman of whom we are told that he consecrated a long life to coming invariably to the assistance of the strongest side, she was emphatically the friend of the oppressed, and one of that band who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. The existence of a group of such women is one of the most precious national possessions of the American people. Miss Crandall, now Mrs. Filio, is still, in 1889, alive and in full vigor of mind and body. The revenge which the whirligig of time has brought to her is the triumph of her cause. She now enjoys a small pension granted to her by the government of the United States in recognition of her services to the anti-slavery cause. Another of the famous anti-slavery women of the United States was Lucretia Mott. She, too, was a Quakeress, as were a very considerable proportion of the women who first took up the abolitionist movement. At one time, the Puritan inhabitants of New England, who had fled from their homes in Europe to escape persecution, instituted the most cruel persecution against the Quakers and all sects who differed from their Puritan creed. The persecuted are often only too ready to become persecutors in their turn. Lucretia Mott's ancestors, the Coffins, descended from the ancient Devonshire family of that name, had fled before this Puritan persecution to the island of Nantucket to the east of Massachusetts. Here Lucretia was born in 1793, and here her childhood was passed until she was 11, when her father removed to Boston, Massachusetts. Lucretia and her younger sister, spoken of in her father's letters as the desirable little Elizabeth, had opportunities of education at Boston that would have been quite out of the question in the primitive island of their birth. At the age of 18, Lucretia married James Mott, and her home henceforward was at Philadelphia. Partly for the sake of educating her own children, and partly with a view of helping her mother, who had been left a widow with 5 children to support, Lucretia Mott opened a school. When she was about 30 years of age, she began gradually to be drawn into work of a more public kind, through her deep interest in the many moral movements of her time. Foremost among these stood the anti-slavery agitation. She traveled for many thousands of miles, speaking and lecturing for the anti-slavery cause. It was then, even in America, quite a novelty for women to take an active part in public movements, and some of the more old-fashioned of the abolitionists did not approve of the participation of Lucretia Mott and other women in the work. But Garrison was always, from the first, as eager for the equality of women as he was for the emancipation of the slaves, and he felt too deeply what the anti-slavery cause, in England and America, owed to women, to tolerate their being set on one side without any recognition of their work. However, at first only a minority held this view, and the difficulty, which some men felt in working with women, caused Lucretia Mott to form the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. At the first meeting of this society, none of the ladies felt competent themselves to take the chair, so they elected a Negro gentleman to that position, a choice which Mrs. Mott explained a few years later in the following words: "Negroes, idiots, and women were in legal documents classed together, so that we were very glad to get one of our own class to come and aid us in forming that society." In 1840, Lucretia Mott was one of the delegates chosen to represent American societies at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention held in London in that year. It is well known that she and all the other lady delegates were refused recognition because they were women. Sir John Bowring, Mr. Ashurst, and Daniel O'Connell were among those who protested against this arbitrary act of exclusion, but the protest was in vain. Garrison had not been present when the question of refusing to allow the lady delegates to take part in the convention was discussed. He arrived in England 5 days after the question had been settled. With characteristic generosity, he refused to sit as a delegate where the ladies had been excluded. They had been relegated as spectators to a side gallery, and he insisted on taking his seat there also. The absurdity of holding a World's Anti-Slavery Convention, in which the chief workers against slavery were present as spectators, not as participators, caused a great deal of discussion at the time, and the general movement in England towards the social, educational, and political equality of women may be said to date from that period. For 30 years Lucretia Mott hardly ever let a day pass without doing something to weaken the fabric of slavery, which she felt to be the greatest curse of her native land. Her manner and voice were sweet, solemn, and tranquil. Her small and fragile figure, her exquisite womanliness of demeanor, made it difficult to believe that she could become the object of violent hatred and persecution. Yet she had often known what it was to stand on a platform in the midst of a shower of stones and vitriol, and to endure in silence the unmanly insults of the pro-slavery press. The simple and direct sincerity of her mind, her forgetfulness of self, and her tranquil courage carried conviction to the minds of thousands that she had a message worth listening to. But at first many, even of her own religious community, thought it necessary to show their disapprobation of her conduct by refusing to recognize her when they met. She owned that this had caused her considerable pain, but it never caused her to swerve for a moment from the course she felt to be that of duty. She usually took a share of the seat behind the door in railway cars, because that place was ordinarily assigned to negroes, and would converse kindly with her fellow passengers there. At the celebrated trial in 1859 of Daniel Dangerfield, a fugitive slave, Lucretia Mott remained all through the long hours of suspense by the side of the prisoner. The trial and the courthouse were watched by two crowds, both in the greatest anxiety and suspense, one hoping for the release, the other, and by far the larger and more dangerous, hoping for the condemnation of the man. At last the long trial ended in victory for the right. Daniel Dangerfield was declared a free man, but the authorities of the court thought it would be impossible to get him away in safety through the angry pro-slavery crowd without an escort of police. Their fears were found to be groundless, for when the doors of the court were thrown open and the slave walked out a free man, Lucretia Mott, the aged Quaker lady, was by his side. Her hand on his arm was a sufficient protection, and he passed through the angry crowd in safety. Very soon after this came the War of Secession. The abolitionists knew, though the politicians did not, that this war would decide the question of slavery. As all the world knows now, they were right. The American people were enabled to prevent the secession of the slave states, and in 1863 a proclamation of President Lincoln announced the abolition of slavery in the United States. Lucretia Mott lived for 17 years after this crowning victory of her life's labors. She died on 11th November, 1880, universally respected and loved by those who knew her. End of Chapter 23. End of Some Eminent Women of Our Times by Millicent Garrett FAWCETT.